Hi, I'm Tom Paragi with the Alaska chapter of the Wildlife Society, and I'm here today in the home of Dr. Robert Weeden to interview him for our celebrating our Wildlife Conservation Heritage Program. It's June 8th, 2006, and we're in Fairbanks, Alaska. So, Dr. Weeden, could you start off, please, with a little bit about your early life? What inspired you to go into the conservation field?
Well, Tom, I grew up in suburban Massachusetts, and there wasn't much about home that would make one want to be a wildlifer. However, I did have one relative who lived across the street who loved birds and taught me bird watching. And I still remember the very, very old, I guess it was 1944, little handbook of North American birds that it contained about 60 species in it and nice color plates. And that's what I learned birds from. And that was the thing that, of course, that sort of thing doesn't have any permanent effect on anyone unless there's something inside of them just waiting to learn, waiting to accept it. And it kind of, bird watching became my excuse, you might say, for being out and going out into the scrubby woods of southeastern Massachusetts and catching my first pumpkin seed sunfish on a worm and a bent pin, all that good stuff. So that was the earliest time I ever knew anyone who really loved the outdoors for its own sake. Of course, my dad and mom loved the outdoors because it produced vegetables, and it was during the Depression, and we needed veggies. And although mom was a city girl, she appreciated lovely countryside. But basically, they were not wildland folks,
Okay.
not even rural.
So roughly when was that when you met the neighbor, the bird watcher?
Yeah, I suppose I was about 11, which would make it about 1944. Um, in the midst of the war with the planes from Quonset Naval Air Station flying overhead, big squadrons of um, flying fortresses, sometimes 75 or 80 of them, droning across the sky for the 10
Mm.
minutes it took them to go from one horizon to another. Very different, but yeah, that's where I grew up.
The this early interest in the bird watching, then did that develop in what you tried to take in high school? You realized you wanted to work do something related to the outdoors, and so did that develop into your high school courses and thoughts about college? And
I was the first youngster in any, as far back as we can go into the 1800s in my family, to ever go to college. And I guess it was just that time in our country's history that kids of lower middle class sort of began realizing they had a choice to go on after high school, not just go to work on the farm or in the cotton mills or whatever, but to go on. And I always realized that I didn't have any skills with my hands, so I figured I better have some skills with my head, otherwise I'd be sunk. And so I did take the college curriculum in high school. Didn't know where it was going to go. Had an interview once with a counselor in high school who looked at my record and said, "Well, you're terrible in math, so don't go into engineering. And I don't think you've got any interest in business, and you've got no business to be in business anyway. You're not good. You're not set up for that." She went down the list of things that I was not qualified for, but she didn't know anything about biology, so she didn't mention it. And I thought, aha, biology, that's for me. So that's about the time I decided when I go into college that I would be in the life sciences. However, meanwhile, this a combination of the bird watching and reading far too much Zane Grey late at night gave me a real urge to go west and to be in the mountains and ride a horse into the sunset, all those wonderful things you're going to do when you're 11. And so I decided when I flipped through the University of Massachusetts catalog, they had such a thing as wildlife management. And I thought, oh boy, that'll be just great. And having realized that such a thing existed, that's what I took. And I never did waver in all of the Well, I went to school from the time I was 5 till the time I was 26. That's 21 consecutive years, right? It's horrible to contemplate, but that whole time I just really felt that I was in the right place.
Great. And so you did your bachelor's degree at Amherst?
Bachelor's at Amherst, in the School of Forestry, in the department or division, I can't remember which, of wildlife management, very close to the forestry curriculum. And you satisfied many of the requirements for being a forester at the same time. And wildlifers used to go around chanting clear cut and burn, clear cut and burn. If I had a forest, I'd clear cut and burn. And just, to needle the foresters. But I sure learned, dendrology and forest, silviculture and mensuration and photogrammetry and all those good things, as well as your wildlife stuff.
Okay. And then at that point, you probably decided graduate school is the next step. Where did you end up going for your master's degree?
I went to the University of Maine in Orono. I did want to mention that my first wildlife prof was Reuben Edwin Trippensey, who was one of the folks that was really a peer of Aldo Leopold's, although much less known, and deservedly so. Reuben Edwin Trippensey lived to 90 some odd years old. In fact, visited us here in this house in Alaska in the late 70s or early 80s or something. But he was always a bookish sort of a person, and everything seemed secondhand. In other words, as a professor, he was telling folks things that he had just learned out of a book. So it's like the old saying about how far ahead of a professor is from a student, about 20 minutes of cramming. That's about it. And, the kids sensed that. And so I guess I was a bit starved for somebody that really could show some experience in the country as well as just with the books and the ideas. But he did give us a good foundation in what was then known as wildlife management, and I graduated in 1953 and then went up to the University of Maine to start my master's, and there Dr. Howard Mendel was the leader of the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, and I was a student at that unit at the University of Maine. Howard was working on ring-necked ducks mostly at the time, and in fact I spent part of a summer helping him find ring-necked duck nests on one of those floating bogs that it's, Chamaedaphne and Labrador tea and sphagnum and whatnot. It just oozes up and down as you walk on it. Well, that's where the ring-necked ducks are nesting.
Yeah.
And it was great fun, sweating and killing horseflies and looking for duck nests. And then the other person who was there was Dr. Malcolm Coulter, and Mal Coulter was a mammalogist, but he was younger than Howard, and he was more involved with the graduate students and liked to take us out into the woods and try to get us lost. That was basically what he was trying to do. And so I really got to be very good friends with Mal, and in fact we still correspond after all these years. My project at the University of Massachusetts was to study the nesting of woodcock. The American woodcock had been studied for a long time by a number of people, but no one had ever found more than one or two nests. So naturally they just send the next graduate student on that impossible task, right? And say, go north and find nests. So I went to a little road up the Penobscot and then off to the east, where there was a bunch of old farms abandoned and growing into alders. And I soon realized that, first of all, in that nice humid environment deep down in the alders, you could actually smell nesting woodcock, because the females would drop their feces, which they had pent up during these hours on the nest, and they dropped them all around not too far from the nest, and you could smell it. Wow. And so I got a nose for the work, you might say, and amazed people by finding a few nests. However, the main thing was that I realized that the woodcock had a fairly short stay on any given acre of land, because they didn't want to nest there while it was still grass. And in fact, it's hard for them to probe for earthworms through dense sod. So when the alders first came in, it would shade out the grass. The ground became very soft, and I suppose the alders were fixing nitrogen, and probably the earthworms were enjoying the fallout from the leaves. And it became good feeding ground. But after about 20, 25 years, the alders begin to decay, open up again, grass comes back, woodcock are gone. So they have this kind of little window of 15 years, maybe 20 years, depending on the site, and then they've got to move somewhere. It was really quite interesting because it unexpectedly opened up the idea of human history affecting the critter when I was not into human history. I was thinking of the animal, in this case, the woodcock. Another notable thing that happened then is that I realized I had a facility for imitating bird sounds. So sometime when we're not on camera, I'll imitate the hiccup and fart of a woodcock. Is it?
All right.
And then from the University of Maine at Orono, I guess I should back up and say that one of the things I did to earn my supper there was to work for the unit so many hours, not on my own project. But, and one of the things I did was to open up fisher carcasses. The trappers at that time were catching fisher by mistake in marten sets, and the fisher were increasing. So Mal Coulter had this project to do what he could do with skinned fishers. And I remember he and I both were just absolutely amazed at how rapidly porcupine quills decay on the skin, just under the skin of a fisher. And the males especially seem to really go in for porcupines in a big way. And their mouth and gums and jaws and noses would be just full of quills, but anything inside under the skin was gone. It was just a little line, a black line it was all that was left of it. So they really were, they were softening them up chemically somehow or other, rather than trying to cope with them as big sticks in their skin. And that was pretty amazing to me. And I never did see a live fisher. I have never seen a live fisher, but I saw a lot of dead ones real early. And then I also learned a little bit about canoeing because I was sent to band black ducks on the Penobscot River. And I was brought up to a little cabin where there was a 20-foot canvas over wood canoe and some paddles and some big folding traps made out of, on a 4x8 plan, made of hinged framework and chicken wire mesh. And I'd put that on this 20-foot canoe, haul that canoe down to the Penobscot River by myself, and put the trap on and motor off. It had a side mount, and motor off up the Penobscot, drop the trap off at the head of a little island somewhere, set it up and bait it, and then start coming back and banding the ducks. And it was a bit lonely. I was a Massachusetts boy out in the wilderness. I remember being terribly, embarrassingly frightened by a raven, the first one I ever saw. It just came by me and squawked. It just came right over the top of me and gave this horrible bellow, and I must have leaped a foot and a half. But I get used to those. Went to UBC after that. I decided I want to go west and north, and at that moment in time, UBC was the farthest institution that would give a PhD in wildlife and zoology as you go north and west in the continent. Now, as of however long, not very many years thereafter, the University of Alaska began to offer a PhD. But by accident, I was around at the time that UBC was the place. And luckily, I was paired with Dr. Ian McTaggart Cowan as my major advisor. So he and Jimmy Bendel, who was the person that helped mostly with the field work, set me on the course of ptarmigan research that actually spanned from my UBC beginnings in summer of '56 right through to the summer of 1970 when I finally stopped doing that ptarmigan research. UBC was vastly bigger than any university I'd been into. And it was also a zoology department rather than wildlife, so it wasn't much on the applied side.
Hmm.
You learned the classic zoology, and then you worked with wild whole animals that distinguish you from everybody else, the histologists and the geneticists and so on, the physiologists. And you were looked down upon a little bit, and UBC was one of the very few universities in Canada, and the only Western one at the time, that had this kind of a program. It was almost a natural history program. But you had to get a really solid grounding in zoology. So I kind of went back, you might say, to pick up a lot of courses in genetics and physiology and anatomy that I never had as a student at forestry schools, wildlife and forestry schools, which was good for me, very good. And I learned to love the alpine country because in the summer of '56 I came up to Alaska to start ptarmigan work. I walked into John Buckley's Alaska Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit on the U of A campus, and Bert Libby and John Buckley took me under their wing, recognized me for a greenhorn, a chichaco, and took me up the Steese Highway one day early in May. That year, the Steese opened early enough that you could take what we would now call a 4x4. At that time, it was an old Army cast-off vehicle. And we took it up the highway and bounced ourselves over brooks that were flooding over the road and whatnot, and got to Eagle Summit. There were caribou, by the way, crossing the road in Chattanooga that year. And it was one of the last years in which the Steese 40-mile caribou herd wintered well west and at a lower elevation than it normally summered. And I guess it does that periodically, maybe even now. But I remember that there weren't very many years after that they did show up near Fairbanks. We went up to Eagle Summit and talked with Alice and Bill Herring, who were summertime miners at the camp there at Eagle Creek at mile 105, Steese Highway. And they allowed us how it would be fun to have some company. There was an old shack there that had been built in 1905 out of local logs, and about a 16-foot wall the taper would be from an 8-inch stick to about a 4-inch stick. And then the next one would be reversed with moss in between, and that's where I lived one summer while doing my ptarmigan research. And it was really quite remarkable for me because that was my first real exposure, being alone without academic company, living a long way from anywhere. And I just got such a enormous thrill out of walking up the ridge and looking out and realizing, with a road map in hand, there wasn't nothing, nowhere, anywhere from there. The Steese Highway angled up and stopped at the Yukon at Circle, but the Livengood Road stopped at Livengood. It didn't go up anyway, north of the Yukon. And to the southeast, it was a long way to Chicken, or Eagle. So you had a radius of, except in the Fairbanks direction, of 100 and something miles in any direction, and you would never meet another road. And it was just so incredible for me as a New England suburbanite, you might say. And of course, all the letters home that I wrote all my life, actually, until my mom and dad died, I would be describing this stuff, and they could not fathom that. I don't think they ever understood. "What are you doing, Bobby?" they would say. Well, I try to explain, but it was pretty well impossible. It's interesting to be exposed to the fact that your own life, which is so comfortable for yourself, is very strange for even people in your own family,
I have the same experience.
Yeah. So that was my academic work. Dr. McTaggart Cowan, by the way, was a really important person for me. He, I guess he was probably the person most widely known by the general public of all of my university professors, because he was on television. He gave hundreds of lectures every year. He was a very flamboyant, impressive guy, smart as heck, and just loved the outdoors. You know, he had a string of 70 years that he and a friend went deer and elk hunting in the Rockies, and just without a break. It was
Wow.
pretty amazing. So just, I don't know, just the whole thing that he was comfortable on television. He was a dean of the graduate studies at UBC. He was a major prof. He was a lecturer in butterflies or a lecturer in auklets or anything you wanted to name. He could lecture in it, and would, by the way, at the drop of a hat. And it's kind of odd, I guess, that Judy and I now live within a few miles of where he still lives, in Victoria, BC.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that was your path to Alaska then, was in graduate school.
The link, the
Yeah.
bridge to Alaska, was actually James Washington Brooks, because Jim Brooks came down in 1956 in the fall to start his PhD to work out some data on sea lions, which he had done.
Walrus.
No, sea
Oh,
lions.
it's the same-
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And he was my roommate, so he and I shared an office every day for a long time. He would take periodic trips back north because he was still director of game for the territory. But in 56-7 and 57-8, he spent most of the years, those 2 years there, and I got to know him real well. He went back up in 1958 to pick up where he left off with the Department of Fish and Game. It was still territorial at the time, but statehood was imminent. And when he left, he said, "Bob, if you're around in a year or so, I'm going to be hiring people. Give me a call." So I did, and he did. I recall one incident about Jim Brooks
Can you
this.
hold that thought on the incident with Jim
Yep,
Brooks?
yep.
I really got to get rid of the bee.
Okay, I was
It's
wondering.
getting louder and louder.
Open the window.
Is
Is it-
the window open here?
Yeah, there's two little clips on it, I think.
Oh, okay.
So there's buzzing on the
Oh, yeah.
on all the first question, but so the incidents with
Yeah, that's
Jim
okay.
Brooks.
The same exact window they had in my house.
Well, they're Anderson window walls, I guess, or is it Pella? Anyway, one of those.
There we go.
You can leave that open.
Oh, okay.
Just leave it open now.
Do you have a dog outside?
Nope.
Okay.
Oh, well, gosh, now I don't know if the dog is outside. You don't want the interruption if the dog comes?
Did a dog walk by?
Shh.
I heard a bark earlier.
Oh.
Yeah. And that shouldn't bring any more bees in?
Probably not.
Okay.
We'll see. We'll stop if we can.
Okay, stand by and we pick it up on with
Yeah.
the Jim Brooks.
There was an incident relating to Jim Brooks that I think is worth telling about because he got to be very well established in the wildlife profession, of course, himself, both as a biologist and then mostly as an administrator. Jim was going to take his comprehensive exam, which was required of all PhD students. And the exam was kind of set up for folks that had been in zoology all of their lives, and they had taken all of these ologies, and they knew everything ology if it had a bio kind of a name, you know, entomology and parasitology and everything. It was pretty daunting for us whose background was a little skimpier. And Jim had been away from his, you know, undergraduate background for a long time, so he was pretty apprehensive. One day, in his usual mock self-confidence, he came up to a bunch of us and said, "Okay, ask me anything at all." And he expected to be asked, what's the origin of the zygomatic arch in fish, or, you know, something like that. He was all prepped for that. Somebody said, "What are the orders of insects?" "Insects? Are they going to ask me about insects?" And the next day, he was heard mumbling down the corridor, "Fleas, flies, butterflies, bugs, beetles, bees. Fleas, flies, butterflies, bugs, beetles, bees." He was just trying desperately to remember all those orders of insects. Quite interesting. He did invite me to go to Alaska as a biologist, and about that time I asked Judy to marry me, and she said yes. So in June of 1959, we were married in Ontario, her home, and almost immediately got in her old Pontiac and weaved our way northward, arriving in Fairbanks sometime in the second week of July in 1959. So that's when I came up as a permanent resident. I had been here several summers as a ptarmigan biologist, and then I'd disappear again. But that was the time I came to stay.
And you had met Judy in British
At
Columbia?
British BC, she was at UBC, yeah, and also taking zoology. Also a student of Dr. Cowan's. Yeah. She was a biologist, had done a lot of really important work in bird territoriality. She did her work on ovenbirds in Algonquin's provincial park as a student at U of T, and wrote some papers about bird territoriality that were 40 years later, they were still being referred to. And she came up here and got a job at the University of Alaska as a part-time teacher and part-time researcher. She got Academy of Science, National Academy of Science grants, and studied territoriality in songbirds up at Eagle Summit while I was up there doing the work on ptarmigan. And then in the school year, she taught from 1959 to 1972. She taught in the biology department, comparative anatomy and animal behavior. She started the animal behavior course up there. It was quite fun.
So she had the appointment first, and then eventually
She
you
had the
followed
appointment,
her.
that's right, and I was with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, so I was actually at that very moment, we both had offices on campus because Fish and Game's office was in what they would call Club Dormitory, or Club Dorm, which was one of the very earliest dormitories in what is now the pathway between the library and Eielson building, very close to where Copper Center is, the Wood Center. And it was a wooden structure, 2 stories high and a basement. The ROTC had taken over the basement, so we were listening to rifle fire much of the day. And the volunteer fire people had an office there too. But mostly it was graduate students in biology and wildlife and some fish and game folks that were still on campus. There was no other place for us.
How many of
downtown.
them were you?
Well, let's see, Robert Rausch and Bud Burris and Frank Jones and myself. We were not in the same building as the Co-op Wildlife Research Unit. That was in the biology building. So Buckley might still have been there then. Or it might have been Robert Falcon Scott who succeeded Buckley as the head of the research unit. But so there were some unit people around, but not in the same building. I would guess that there were probably only a half a dozen of us biologists from Fish and Game. Now, Dave Murray was then a student working on beaver in Tetland, and he had an office down the end of the corridor in the same corridor that I did in this small building. So graduate students were kind of mixed up with all the rest of us at that time.
Sounds like. So for the period then, right after you were involved as a lobbyist for about a year around 1970, then you began teaching at the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Yes, that's right. And I was really lucky. I was the only member of the wildlife department at the time who was really interested in managerial problems, because that's where I had come from. Every day I was listening to the managers moan. And a lot of the other folks up there, although they were, sympathetic and had some interest in these problems, basically they wanted to do research. And what they wanted to teach was research-related science. And I thought, well, this is a wildlife program. It's different from biology only, really, in that it has a management dimension to it. Otherwise, why do you distinguish between wildlife and tame life? It's all life. So I was asked at first to take my turn teaching various courses that were on the books, but then I began what came to be a habit of mine, and that is designing new courses. For example, we were just, in the profession as a whole, we were just beginning to think about ecosystem management. First in fisheries, but then later in the terrestrial species. And it took the guise of multi-species management, because when you have to consider 2, 3, 4 species, you take different steps than if you just focus on one, like caribou or polar bear. And of course, anybody who tries to put together a balanced package, a long-term package of habitat preservation in the interior of Alaska for both caribou and moose simultaneously, has to know that that's a tough job. So anyway, but I thought that in the wildlife profession as a whole in North America, lots of wonderful examples of both the need for and the difficulty of and the ways of solving the problems of multi-species management. So I put together a course in that, and it was great fun, especially the graduate students that took it had enough background to realize what you were doing. And I use examples. The fishery management in the Great Lakes had undergone a real revolution. The lamprey had come in, and it was tough times from all of the raking of the terribly. All of that, I didn't care what the species were. It was just illustrating the interactions, and that was great fun. And I was pleased to be able to be allowed to do that. And then I taught a course in the wildlife program in, I guess, wildlife policies is what it was called. But about the time I offered that wildlife policies course, which was meant to get into such things as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so what were the politics behind the act, what was it meant to solve, what's happening to it now, what does it face in the future. And as you know, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act seems to be facing problems essentially every year. It never dies, never goes away. So I taught that course, but about that time a new program started to develop, and I became very interested in it in the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and that was what became the Department of School of Agriculture and Land Resources Management, SALRM. It was headed by the agriculture people. The school dean was Dr. James Drew, but the natural resources part of it, and the part that did most of the teaching, was headed by Bonita Neeland, who was the botanist and spouse of Ken Neeland, who was a famous parasitologist and gun expert in fish and game. Bonita became the department head, and she was recruiting people. She got John Fox to take care of some hydrology and forestry issues, and various folks, Alan Jubenville for kind of professional recreation management. And I came on part-time again from the school, for the school, and began teaching a lot of the courses in so kind of the social side of biology, you might say. Social, including law and politics and planning, as well as straight biology. And with the combination of the freedom I got from the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the freedom I got from Bonita in the school, I began kind of following my inclinations over the next 15 years or so, I guess. At first I thought to myself, well, what's important to wild animals? It's their habitat. What determines what's going to happen to the habitat? It's whoever owns it makes a decision. And if it's a public owner, as most of our land is, they make a decision through some kind of a planning process. So wildlifers ought to know something about planning. So I taught a course in land use planning, focusing on agencies and how they handle their land planning questions. Then I said to myself, well, that's all well and good, but the land planner is also pretty much of a head in the clouds person who really is following politics, because it's, well, first of all, economics, because the people who want to use land are the folks that can get some money from it. They can sell the timber or sell the minerals or sell the oil or something. So a person really ought to know something about resource economics. That's where my work with the Institute of Everything came in, because I really absorbed quite a lot about economics, a subject I had hated in school, avoided wherever possible, but I really do think it's fascinating. And so I began teaching natural resource economics as part of other classes, but along with that, you've got the people trying to manage land and the people trying to use land, and over all of that is a set of political decision makers. So naturally enough, I said to myself, well, what should a young wildlife biologist know about how political decisions are made? And I realized that the really essential question for that person, the student, would be, what role, if any, does science play in the decision-making process? And that's kind of how I legitimized the class as a natural resources or wildlife class, because otherwise it would be taught in political science, and I couldn't get away with it because I wasn't a political scientist.
Right.
So I had to play politics in order to teach politics at the University of Alaska. We did it successfully, and it was really great fun. I taught natural resource policies, which were policies. Policies are simply what you decide to do when you've got a choice. Your policy may be not to have anything to do with changing so-and-so's diapers, and that's, you're faced with a choice. You either do or don't, and you decide not to. Well, that's a policy, and you can make the policy through law. You can make the policy by how you spend your money or don't spend your money. Lots of ways of implementing a policy, but basically it's just making a decision. And so I taught that, but then I taught the details of the laws meant to carry those policies out from the sphere of the political decision into the actual action on the ground. Somebody's got to make it work. And the questions there are, is it really enforced? Is the money given to make it work? Are the right people hired to do it? Are there intervening agencies that are angry that this whole thing was set up and will do anything to cut you off at the bootstraps? And the answer to all of which is yes, of course. But I taught natural resource legislation as a course with that name for many years. And then I guess I said to myself, well, all of this politics really is started off by what we really deeply believe in. And what is it that we really believe in? We're a Christian nation, and so by and large, it's the precepts. It's where Christianity as a religion the rubber meets the road in how people behave towards land. They carry out their ideas of our own role in nature and with respect to God. They carry them out in some form, unwittingly usually, in how they treat land. And another thing is capitalism. I mean, we're a capitalist society, and so what is capitalism? What are its assumptions? And they're huge. And the other one is science. So you've got science, capitalism, and religion as the basis for how we think about life. And all of those come together in your ethical umbrella that you carry with you, maybe folded, maybe unfolded, but it's there with you, and it bends you in a certain direction. So an opinion that you hear today about a specific subject may really rub you raw, and you don't know exactly why, but you know that it really stings, or you like it. I really like that guy. I agree with him. And so I taught environmental ethics, which is kind of the basis by which we act or react with and toward nature. And that became, I guess that was my final climb towards some kind of an understanding of what humanity is all about. And about that time I decided I would retire. But along the way, I did get slightly involved in politics, and this is where Jay Hammond comes in. I told you that I met him in 1970 in the Alaska State Legislature, and he kind of envied me in a way, because as an academic, I was able to say things that he couldn't afford to say as a politician, but somehow we usually agreed on things. Also, as a researcher, I had been, until very recently, kicking around in the bush, and it had been way too long since Jay had been kicking around in the bush. I mean, he'd been a commercial fisherman, he'd been a wolf hunter and all that sort of stuff, but he had also been a politician, and politicians get pasty in the face, and they have to wear neckties, which he hated to do. And he really liked me because I hated neckties too. So we got a friendship going. And along about 1974, early in 74, a bunch of folks at the university were realizing that Jay Hammond was becoming a noticeable public figure, and that he seemed to have a knack for independence of thought and for seeing through things, at least wanting to know what the options were. I mean, Jay always wanted to know what choices there were. Don't just take the first thing that comes along. The first horse might not be the fastest horse, right? So all of that set well with like Tom Morehouse in political science, because his whole business is trying to provide options, alternatives, and weighing alternatives. Here's the good and here's the bad for each of these alternatives. 18 alternatives is good because that's more research, right? But he liked the idea that maybe here was somebody that didn't have his mind all made up. And Carl Benson and Dave Klein and a whole bunch of folks at the university began saying, I think he'd make a good governor. And I had more or less of an ear with Jay, and I suggested it to him, and lo and behold, he didn't say no right away. He did laugh, but he didn't say no because other people in other towns had been saying the same thing to him, possibly for different, but possibly for the same reasons. And I know he was very popular with all the conservation people, no matter what part of the state they were in. So we convinced him to run, and we took part in his campaign. First time I'd been involved in campaign politics. We had an event right here in this house where we had 60 people that met Jay and Bella, and it was really quite a kick. It was summertime. He was running in the primary election, and he was trying to beat Walter Hickel, and you may remember that was within a logger's handful of fingers, that the number of votes, it was a tiny number of votes that separated them. Anyway, Jay and Bella came one August evening. It was getting dusky. We had a sign out that I put out there. Judy didn't want me to. She was too embarrassed, but I put a sign out saying no smoking, and we both knew that Bella smoked. So she came wearing lovely black sweater and black skirt and ivory beads and looking very lovely. She's a very handsome woman. Anyway, she had to go out and smoke. So she did go outside, didn't make any fuss. Naturally, she wouldn't. Standing out there in the yard, my kids were out there trying to stay out of everybody's way, but they were running their bikes back and forth. Well, they came roaring around the corner of the bikes and just about collided into Bella Hammond. And they stopped and put on the brakes, and they looked at her and said, "You see, smoking is bad for your health." Smart ass kids. Meanwhile, inside, Jay was chatting with all these 60 odd people or so. Yeah, fairly odd people, but influential. And he did win, and shortly thereafter asked me to join his group down there and form this division of policy development and planning. Used to be the division of planning. Bob Pavitt had been the former head of that, director of that division. And its main job at that time had been to be the receiving entity for federal grants like housing and urban development. Hundreds of thousands of dollars came to the state for planning purposes, distributed out to the municipalities and so on. That was its function. What we wanted to do is to have it the group that looked into the urgent situations that the governor was going to have to decide on and produce the policy options. What can you do? And our job was also to try to get all of the commissioners together occasionally to form some sort of a coherent policy to present to Jay, rather than natural resources coming to him one day and making a pitch, highways, transportation coming another day, fish and game coming yet another day, and environmental conservation coming, on and on and on. He might have 6 different visits by 6 different commissioners, all on the same subject, and he's supposed to be the one that puts this together to make a decision. Well, he wanted help. And I don't know if we did help, but I think he was happy. It was a wonderful time of my life. I felt very much involved. Probably I had almost reached the level where I would become incompetent. that level of politics just below the top, where you don't have to be elected to anything, but you can advise somebody who was. And that was pretty fun. Pretty fun. We did okay. I think one of the big things really that I had a small part in and that I admire Jay for is the permanent fund. I mean, otherwise we were going to spend all that money just as fast as we could spend it. And I wrote once that the one thing we could not afford to do is to really build up a dependent industry on oil and gas, because it's going to disappear. And the metaphor I used was building sandcastles in the top half of an hourglass, which is pretty close to what it would have been. But people wanted pantyhose factories in Valdez and so on. And you know how popular those kinds of ideas are. Stupid as they may be, economically stupid, nevertheless, they're really popular locally. Until you get to the place where it's going to happen, and then says, not in my backyard. You know, everybody doesn't want it then. But it was interesting to be involved in that kind of a debate over local processing versus sending the stuff away, getting the maximum money, and then bringing the money back and putting it to use, having your own choice of what to do with it. And whereas getting royalty oil, all you've got is barrels of oil, and what do you do with them? But if you convert it to money, then you can do most anything you want with it. And I think it's been a good thing. I don't know if it's up to 30 billion now today, but it's close.
So as a biologist, you at that point working for planning, you were really broadly working.
Oh, heck yeah, yeah.
Still tied to natural resources,
Yep,
probably somehow,
yep,
but very,
somehow.
very broad.
But as I said, I had gotten pretty close to the end of my competence in most of these things. You know, as a professor, you get pretty good at saying things you don't really know and sounding convincing. So I was practiced, and that was okay. The difficulty was saying it less than 50 minutes. Down at Juneau, you weren't given 50 minutes to say anything. No, I remember one time I was asked in 1976, 75 to go over to Whitehorse and testify on behalf of the state on their position on the Trans-Alaska gas pipelines, which were first coming up then in 1975, 76. Justice Thomas Berger was giving these hearings on the Mackenzie oil pipeline. And he wanted some input from the state, so I was sent over to do that. And interestingly enough, I appeared before Tom Berger as a pleader for the state's position on natural gas, which affected Yukon and Canada because it related to where the Alaskan gas would go, offshore to the east and pick up and go up the Mackenzie, or inland to the Alaska Highway, or avoid everything and go to Valdez and liquefy it and go on. Anyway, I saw Tom Berger a number of times at a number of meetings after that, but when I retired about 12 years ago, I got into a crowd that needed a fourth in tennis, one of whom was Tom Berger. So it kind of came full circle from testifying in a hearing to playing tennis with the guy.
So how long were you with the Division of Planning and
About
Policy?
18 months.
Okay.
But that's the limit of the time I had off from the university. I just took professional leave.
So it's like a sabbatical. Or
Yep.
Yeah.
And the state paid me instead of the university. So they weren't out any money. They had to replace me. But then I discovered that they didn't really need to replace me. So when I picked up the courses when I came back. It was actually good fun. Bader was the fellow, Harry, came along and was my replacement for that year and a half or so. And then later he came and was picked up the job himself.
In the mid-70s?
I think so, yeah. Unless I've got it.
I don't think so. He's the same age as I am, and he would have been in junior high.
Okay, well then who did replace me? Well, that's a mistake
Okay.
then. Harry was there as a teacher while I was still there, and he and I were on the faculty together. He was teaching his courses and I mine. But then I left, and he picked up my position. That's the way it was. So it was more of a tandem thing. So I don't really quite know how they took over my courses at the university. But that was a good experience too in politics, and but I guess I would say of all of the things I've tried to be, I've had the most fun out of teaching. And now writing is kind of an extension of teaching, so I'm getting interested in that as well.
I still remember of all the professors I had there in the mid 1980s. You were talking a lot of time from experience of having done these things, worked in the planning, the government, worked in the field, and that was very interesting to me. That's what really struck to me, that here's somebody that actually went out and did this stuff and talks about the good parts and the bad parts of working in state government at high levels like that. So,
and I was lucky to be involved to the extent that I was in the geography of Alaska, because that gave me much better chance to get involved in the national sphere, even international sphere, than if I had been from Iowa. I mean, a biologist studying sharp-tailed grouse in Iowa isn't going to get invited to sit on a panel in Washington. But if you're from Alaska, big country, big wilderness, big oil, new state, everybody wants to go to Alaska. It's dream place, right? So when the Marine Fisheries set up their advisory panel just after the National Marine Fisheries Act was established, 1974 I think was the act, maybe 1975, and by 1976 or 7 they had set up this Marine Fisheries Advisory Council, and they wanted somebody from Alaska, but they didn't want a fisherman, because that was there was a conflict, a natural conflict there. So marine mammals were involved, so I got to be on the Marine Fishery Advisory Council, and I got to work with folks dealing with snook in Florida, and the bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico, and all sorts of stuff. Wonderful learning experience. And then the Marine Mammal Commission asked me to be first on their committee of scientific advisors, but then I kind of graduated and became one of the 3 commissioners. And I was appointed first by Jimmy Carter, and then by Ronald Reagan. And I tell people that it's because neither of them knew me. I've got these little documents signed by them, and they had never met them. Anyway, that was great fun. But that was really wonderful, because, first of all, I kind of enjoy marine mammals, but secondly, Alaska had a lot of marine mammal issues to sort of beat out at the national level. It was a good place to be, because I could bring a lot of that stuff right back in to the classroom. And I was on Audubon's board of directors for 6 years, and again, it's such a huge and complicated and wonderful society of ours. You're always finding new groups of people, communities of people that you really never knew existed, or you only know in theory that they exist. They must be there because we need garbage collectors, but I've never met one, kind of thing. So it was, just in terms of my life experience and meeting and learning about people and how they think, it was great.
So you were involved with the Alaska Conservation Society pretty much from the time it started through its existence and when
Right.
it eventually disbanded?
From the first meeting to the last meeting. I was present at the first meeting.
Which was
I wasn't on
1960?
1960. I was not one of the first board of directors, but I was the president when we dismantled in 1980. So we had a 20-year run, yeah. And that was good. In fact, I was kind of an activist before then, but as a graduate student, you don't kind of have much time to get involved. You know about that.
Sure, I know about that.
Then you start taking activism more seriously, and I guess I've spent now, ever since 1960 for sure, and so that's 46 years in an activist job in one way or another.
Now, ACS, did they spawn other groups that exist today?
Yes. I suspect they do, because we had, I believe, 9 chapters altogether by the time we finished. And
so how many members would
Fairbanks,
you guess?
Anchorage, Kenai, Homer, Kodiak, Skagway, Juneau, Ketchikan, Petersburg, and Sitka all had chapters. And I don't know which ones are still alive. They would have taken another name. They were allowed to and encouraged to incorporate on their own, even when they were members of the consortium, the Alaska Conservation Society, because we felt that the more they did locally, the better off they were. And, they were responsible for raising their own funds. And the only thing that we really held together were, 2 things. One is the publication. which tried to cover the whole state as balanced a way we could. And then secondly, we had an annual meeting, and we tried to finance having reps from all of those groups come north and talk about statewide issues, which wasn't easy at that time. Long way to fly.
So the genesis was here, right in Muskox.
Yep, that's right.
Subdivision.
Yep, Celia's cabin. And I occupied the top bunk on my elbow, watching and listening and participating as somebody stoked the fire, and Woody Woods, Ginny's former husband, and Celia, and Don Foote, the anthropologist who worked on Project Chariot, and Fred Dean and Dave Klein and L. Gerard Swartz. A whole bunch of people were together there starting the place up.
Les Vierick, William Pruitt.
Les was there, Bill Pruitt was there, what's her name? Terry Vierick as well.
Terry?
Yeah. Yeah. And as I say, the first set of officers, there was a John Thompson there who became maybe the first president, I can't quite remember, but he was on the first board. But then after the first year, I guess I never stopped being either on the board or president or editor or all three. The only time was when I quit everything to be down in Juneau. I figured that I had to do that.
Focus.
So, yeah. Well, just a kind of a conflict, because
Yeah.
there were going to be lobbyists from the conservation group sitting in my office, and I didn't want to be their president. Didn't seem right.
Right.
Don't know why.
So, when did your first book, Alaska Promises to Keep, did the idea for that come to you when you were down in Juneau for that period, working on some of these very broad issues?
Mm-hmm. No, it was earlier. I think, first of all, it was the events of the oil discoveries that promised major upset in the way things had been in the earlier 60s. And secondly, the opportunity to be with the Institute of Social and Economic Research, because I got involved in the policy end of things. And I began kind of putting together with these new ideas about oil and gas development, what it was likely to mean, what the money was going to mean, and then the policy aspects of it. It kind of gave me some hope that I could write a book where the circle widened a bit. I wasn't going to be talking only about how polar bear might be affected by oil development. It was kind of a bigger thing than that. And it even got into some of the social issues. And it took me till 1978 to get it published, but it was actually, I wrote the first draft when I was on sabbatical in 1972 down at the University of California in Santa Cruz, which, by the way, is where Judy learned potting. And when she came back, she quit teaching and has been a potter ever since 1972. Down there, I wrote the draft of this book, and then came back and, while trying to peddle it, rewrote it. Finally got a yes from Houghton Mifflin, and then, actually by then it was in pretty good shape, and I got, I didn't have to rewrite. I rewrote a couple of chapters, but most of it was pretty well done. I guess what they wanted mostly is to eliminate the 100 and some odd footnotes that I had, because this was supposed to be read by somebody, not referenced by somebody. So that was the first law that the editor gave me: take out the footnotes as isolated footnotes. If you want to save a few and put them in an appendix, great. People can ignore them easily there.
But it came out at a timely period, published in 1978, but the real fast politics on the D2 stuff really occurred in 79.
The D2 stuff
80.
did, yeah. The oil politics were fairly set by then. The state stance on taxation and whatnot was set. But yeah, it was just in the beginning stages of the main D2 fight. Well, actually, no, the D2 fight was a decade long, but it was when it was pretty hot and heavy. People were beginning to realize they weren't going to put it off forever, partly because the favorable president in Jimmy Carter wasn't going to be around all that long. And as far as the second book is concerned, I think it's a more, in a way, a more mature book. I wrote...
That's Messages from Earth.
Yeah, Messages from Earth. I wrote Promises to Keep partly out of a bit of, what shall I say? Um, I was perturbed that a number of people came to Alaska and stayed here a month and then wrote a book. And it might be pretty good books, but it wasn't, the books didn't have the breadth and depth of understanding I wanted to bring to it as a resident would have. And, no matter how good a writer you are, like whatever, Tom Hanrahan or Lewis Lapham or John McPhee, all of those folks are superb writers. I mean, Lewis Lapham has been editor of Atlantic magazine for years now, and you don't get to be that without being a good writer. But he and they just spent a while here, did their intensive reportage thing, and left. But the questions they didn't ask never came to them, right? The answers never came. So I felt there needed to be a homegrown book. And the same was true with Messages from Earth, but I felt about that this is the kind of book that somebody ought to write about every place on Earth, whether it's Tibet or the Antarctic or Iowa or Alaska. Somebody ought to look at the world around them, the natural world, and the people, the artificial world, you might say, the world of artifice, and ask questions about how they're fitting. And I also think that someone ought to rewrite Messages from Earth. It ought to be done many times by many people in one place, because no one can ever know everything, or everything human changes and everything natural changes, so what do you got? You can't sit still for very long. So the greatest compliment to me would be to find some book in Gulliver's sometime when I'm there, and in the foreword it would say, "Once upon a time I read this old book, now long out of print, by a guy named Bob Weeden, and what he tried to do was this. And here it is, 25 years later, and I'm going to try again."
Now, after your career up here in Alaska, whatever, you retired around 1991?
1990.
1990.
Yep.
At that point, then, you and your wife moved to British Columbia?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you've still kept ties with Alaska? Obviously, you have family here. You still keep conservation ties with Alaska?
No. Send a bit of money once in a while, but in hope it gets at the right places. And I have friends here who write and call and occasionally visit, but no, I don't attempt to keep up to date on what's happening here. I'm in a new geography, and it's got its own demands, I guess.
What are some of the key conservation issues that you're involved with? You're on Salt Spring Island?
Yes, that's right.
Which is just about as far south as you can get in Western
and still
Canada.
Yes, you could take a kayak, and if you were a better kayaker than I am, in probably 6 to 8 hours you would be in America. So it's not very far to San Juan Island. Our community is Salt Spring Island, which is a community of about 11,000 people on a small island. The island's about 15, 16 miles long and 5 or 6 miles wide, very dissected coastline. And all of the problems are it's like Alaska divided by 1,000,000, you might say, in terms of acres. But I've discovered in life that you can be really busy, really puzzled, with problems that 10,000 people can generate, as much as if you're trying to manage the whole world, right? You've only got so many hours of a day, and so you add, like Bush says, let's give 482 million this year to Fish and Wildlife Service, or let's not. And I just say to myself, let's try to raise $4,600 to do this or that with on the island. It's a difference of decimal points, but it's the same process, and it's just as hard. His tools are a bit bigger than mine also. So I'm trying to dig a small ditch with a little shovel, and he's unfortunately digging big ditches with big shovels. So we're focused on the island, and my main work is with the Salt Spring Conservancy, which is a conservancy in the same way that the Nature Conservancy is. It's kind of a land trust. The whole island basically is owned by private individuals. There's only about 10% of the land, which is Crown land. And so what private people decide is what happens to wildlife habitat. Our approach then is to try to raise money to buy a few key pieces, but that's just luck when it happens. The other thing we try to do is get covenants, permanent covenants on land, and that's slow, but it's cheaper by far.
These are like conservation easements?
Well,
Or-
yeah, you can call them easements. They are covenants that are placed on title, and they are perpetually passed along with title. So if Joe Smith sells to Sally Jones, Sally Jones buys knowing she has to treat the land the way Joe Smith set it up in the covenant, and that goes on and on and on. There are two organizations that are certified by the province to hold these covenants on behalf of the public, and we are one of them. They are on that island. There's another conservancy close by that pairs with us. So the two of us hold and monitor each covenant. We visit the area every year, look to see what trees have been cut, if any, why they were cut, whether they should have been, whether it's kosher or not. So there is a monitoring, and there are penalties. Unfortunately, only through court action, but there are penalties because it's a legal document. So there is that, but then we're kind of going down a pyramid. A few lands can be bought, more can be covenanted, a lot more can be placed under a less formal agreement. And a lot of our work has been to get grants for face-to-face stewardship work, one-on-one with landowners. Lots of landowners there have 20 acres, 50 acres, 100 acres, and they just have a little house with a view, and they don't do much of anything with the rest of it. However, if they don't know any better, they may very well be putting their driveway extension to a new shed right on top of a calypso orchid bed, or we've got a number of endangered species and very rare species on the island because ecologically it's a northern outpost of a Mediterranean climate. Very dry, hot summers, very cool, moist winters. And so you've got arbutus and Gary oak and opuntia cactus and all sorts of funny things there that you wouldn't expect, along with the butterflies and alligator lizards and stuff that, kind of it's unusual. So we've got some endangered species to worry about. Sharp-tailed snake, it's one of only 2 places in Canada that has the sharp-tailed snake. And so we talk with these people, and we've talked with several hundred, and we have 70 some odd written management agreements that will die whenever that landowner wants them to or passes the land on. But meanwhile, the wetlands are protected much more than any law protects them. So we feel it's worthwhile. And then we've got our lobbying section as well. We, worry about local land use, what's being zoned differently and what shouldn't be done and what should be done, etc. Right now we're just starting a planning process for the entire harbor in which the town, Ganges, Salt Spring Island, sits. The harbor is getting very, very busy, as you can imagine, with float planes and summer homes and winter homes and businesses and dredging and marinas and all that sort of stuff. It's high time that some sort of a plan were made for that area. But it still has a herring run, and there was still a whale that beached up next to a pub that we were sitting in one day a couple of years ago, a minke whale, and lots of seals and sea lions in the harbor. And so it's ecologically, it's an interesting place to be. It's in jeopardy from increased growth. We're trying to cope with that. So as I say, the scale is small, but the goals are worthwhile, and maybe it fits our energy level these days, I'm not sure. But I felt kind of funny here in Alaska, just saying, yes, we should preserve Eisenbeck, or we should preserve this or that or the other, and I've never been there. You feel kind of silly. But that's not necessary on a small place. You can just go and walk around, see it. And I'm keeping busy, in case you're interested, keeping busy doing other things. I've got, when I went down there, I wanted to keep myself busy outside. So I had grown up in Massachusetts where, as a source of income besides babysitting and mowing lawns, I also picked up windfall apples from orchards. And the smell of those ripe apples, I guess, kind of hit something deep down. And I missed it in
pressing
Alaska.
cider. And
Oh, yeah, that sort of stuff. So when I went to Salt Spring Island, I decided I would have an orchard, and I discovered that there was such a thing as people interested in keeping these heritage varieties of apples that have been around since the 17th century, 18th century. So I've got 150 varieties of apples, the youngest of which was developed in 1900, about 1900, and all the rest of them all a couple of centuries earlier. And so I've got about 200 trees, 3.5 acres, and I do my thing, organic growing, no pesticides, but mowing and thinning and pruning and grafting and planting and harvesting.
sell in a local co-op or
Sell
market.
locally, yep, and out of my own home. I'm going to have refrigeration put into my cold storage area, cool storage area, because the apples start needing to be put in storage in late August, and it's nowhere near cool enough then to get them down to a good keeping temperature. In midwinter, all I need to do is bring in night air with a fan and then close it off and leave the night air in over the daytime. But until you get to November, you can't do that. Meanwhile, the apples are gone. So I can put in a simple refrigeration unit, cool the apples down in September and October when I first pick them, and then I'd be able to keep them February, March, April, whatever, in saleable condition. I can keep them now, but they look kind of wrinkled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tastes good,
Yeah.
pretty wrinkled. But Judy and I make about 75 gallons of cider.
Wow.
She makes about 15 gallons of champagne, apple champagne, and some blackberry wine. So yeah, we're well provisioned. In case of disaster, we'll have lots of blackberry wine.
So is your love of the outdoors still keep you outdoors periodically?
Yep.
Bird watching,
Yep.
kayaking?
We got double kayak was the first thing we got, because that was more sensible in that country than a canoe. Our canoe is still up here. So we double kayak around those very sheltered waters all winter long. You can pick your days and you're out in glassy, calm water. It's really fine because there's lots of marine life. Otters everywhere, land otters in the ocean. There's hardly any on land, they're all in the sea. Lots of otter, lots of mink, raccoons, and seals and sea lions, and porpoises and whales. And besides the wintering birds, it's in terms of gulls, not sandpipers. There's not enough sandy, muddy area. But in terms of gulls, that's where all of Alaska goes in the wintertime. You know, we have lots and lots of mew gulls down there that are breeding right here in Fairbanks in the summer, and Bonaparte's gulls and so on. And lots of auks and auklets and murrelets and pigeon guillemots and rhinoceros auklets and that kind of thing. So I do a lot of bird watching. I lead birding trips. Ducks Unlimited bought a piece of land there, 100 acres of a farm that has a nice wetland and a good-sized lake, as well as a beaver pond and so on. And I lead groups of either Trail and Nature Club people or the general public or kids, and we go and watch birds there.
Oh, neat.
So I keep very busy. And we do go whenever we can get away, and it seems to be, you build up a life that's very busy and you can't leave the pottery, leave the orchard, leave the conservancy, leave everything and just go on a trip, right? So we try to pack something in each summer, and in the summer of 2004, Judy and I came up to canoe Birch Creek, which we did, but Birch Creek was very, very low at the time. Just not much of a snowpack. The snow melted early, it was all gone, the creek was already dropped and clear, and we must have lined about 30 miles out of that 110 that BLM says that's the length of the trip that we took. Just wonderful, though, just fantastic. Because the fires were burning in 2004, as you may remember, early July, late June, early July, and we had to travel through burning woods much of the time we were on the trip. It was just so exciting, it was just so much fun. And we never felt like we were in any danger. We probably were, but if you're stupid, you get by real well. And we just had a ball. So that was our, what, five days out on Birch Creek was our big trip for last year, or 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And last year we took a trip of about 4 days, only this time we took our canoe to Wellsgray Provincial Park up against the west side of the Rockies and canoed 120 kilometers of lake up there in the midst of the mountains. Climbed up to timberline. Great fun.
Well, great. I mean, in the 50 plus years of your career where you've worked in outdoor related and conservation related things, is there any one particular time in the field that's most memorable to you? Encounter with wildlife, some horrific weather, interesting character that you ran into when you were working in the field, something like that?
Well, of course, when you're asked that sort of thing, at first you draw a blank,
Yeah.
and then you remember one thing, but then it goes on and on.
Yeah.
So I'll just stop at one thing. I was young once, and when you're young, just everything smells better and tastes better and looks better, and life is open and exciting. It's just absolutely terrific. Well, as a young lad, fresh out of Massachusetts, I got up to Eagle Summit, and when I was 26, and I was left alone by John Buckley and Bert Libby. They had to go back to work, and meanwhile I was up there tramping the hills. And I remember sitting up there on the summit when, all by myself, it was in the evening, light, but evening, and there's a certain feel about the air. You almost feel submerged because there's kind of a heaviness to it that isn't there during bright daylight. Anyway, I was sitting there swatting mosquitoes and drinking in this huge country around me when I began hearing things, and I don't know what I'm hearing, but I'm hearing something. Well, in about 5 minutes, I noticed some movement down in the willows in the creek, and some caribou were coming out of the creek. Well, it was a group of about 1,500, it turned out. The Steese 40-mile herd, cows, breeding and non-breeding, and with calves from some of them, very few bulls, mostly the cows and calves. They were coming back from having calves. And I happened to be where they wanted to be. So they veered around me and the rock, but they hardly gave me a thought. I mean, they were interested in flies, and they were interested in a mouthful, and they were interested in not falling behind, and they were interested in where did my calf go. Everybody was interested in something, but not me, and it was just the most remarkable experience. And it almost felt as if I was back 25,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, same caribou, same hillside. And of course the Steese 40-mile herd is in those hills, the Tanana Hills, that have never been glaciated, very old terrain, ancient rocks. Birch Creek schist, one of the oldest rocks on the surface of the earth that's exposed, and patched together by these various terrains that came in across the Gulf of Alaska and smashed up against the continental plate millions and millions of years ago. But here I was sitting there amidst this herd, and as I say, it seemed like the sort of no clock anywhere in the world, no clock running. I didn't look at my watch, and caribou didn't look at theirs. They were just there. It was really emotionally just most impressive.
Well, that's a wonderful ending point, I think. We're right at about 5 o'clock, and that was our agreement. And
Excellent. Good show.
You want to kind of conclude it?
It's concluded.
Or just mention thank you in a shot.
I'm sorry.
Do you want to take a picture for the gab?
Yeah.
The gab?
Okay.
So if you want to close it, just thank you for talking.
Oh, okay. Well, Dr. Weeden, this was very special for me, and I really appreciate your taking the time to do this for posterity and for the benefit of the Wildlife Society, because the experiences you have really were during the early years of conservation, and there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from some of the experiences you had. I know certainly as a teacher, you imparted some good ideals and good ethics to me that I've tried to uphold, and I really appreciate the fact that you've sat down and given us some of your rich career up here that we can show other people in future generations that are in the conservation field where some of the things like Kramer's Field came from, because that's something that I take advantage of every day hiking out there. It's a wonderful place.
Well, you know, I was here in the early days, but when I first came, there were folks who had been here in the earlier days. You know, I mean, Sam White and Ray Tremblay and Urban C. or Pete Nelson and Clarence Anderson and all sorts of folks that were here, HB me, here before me. And when you get to be my age and someone interviews you, you'll say, yes, I was here in the early days, but you should have seen some of those real old timers.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've had a wonderful life. Alaska has been a huge part of it. Wonderful place to be young in, great place to raise a family in, wonderful place to have in your memory. And I feel really lucky for that. And I've had this marvelous life, am still having a marvelous life, and I can't figure out how a person can in this totally discombobulated world of ours.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's you're kind of depressed when you go to bed, but after a good sleep, you wake up, the
That's right.
sun's shining, you
That's
can hear
right.
some birds, you know.